They're a story so strange, so entangled with the destiny of millions, that even the slightest change in their thread unravels a different world entirely. History, we say, is written by the victors. But what if the ink was spilled before the first word could be written? What if, in the smoke-choked corridors of a Munich beer hall, on the bitter night of November 8, 1939, a single heartbeat had shifted, and Adolf Hitler had died? At first, disbelief, then shock. The Führer was dead. The German High Command stumbled into confusion. There was no clear successor. Within a fortnight, the Wehrmacht's leadership, fearing total collapse, entered secret negotiations. Britain, unready for another continental war, listened. France hesitated. Churchill, not yet Prime Minister, was still only a voice among many. The world, still raw from the Great War's scars, saw a chance to pull back from the brink. Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague, emerged not as a leader of men, but as a shadow figure, a puppeteer. "This is not peace," he wrote in a private letter. "This is merely the interlude between two acts." The American public, still drowning in isolationism, saw the Führer's death as an end rather than a beginning. Support for a military expansion waned. The arsenal of democracy remained locked away. Slowly, subtly, the United States never entered a European war. Pearl Harbor never provoked retaliation. Japan expanded its empire, unchecked by Pacific interference. China bled quietly. Roosevelt understood the illusion. Evil, he believed, was not merely a man. It was an idea, and ideas do not die in bomb blasts. And the ghost of Hitler, now immortalized not as a monster, but a martyr by extremists, grew louder in death than he had in life. He merely scattered it, like ashes in the wind. Statues were raised in secret, speeches delivered in coded language, a cult of what could have been spread through the youth of the Reich, and in the corners of Eastern Europe. Old alliances began to twist. 6 million voices were not silenced. The camps, without the bureaucratic madness of the final solution, remained sites of imprisonment, not industry. Tragic, yes, but not apocalyptic. Without Hitler's apocalyptic vision of global conquest, the Third Reich shifted. The regime no longer paraded strength in open marshes. It whispered it through walls, through fear. While the world thought Germany had been defanged, its talons grew sharper in the dark, less theatrical, more clinical. The ideology remained. The persecution of Jews, Roma, dissenters. It didn't vanish. It mutated. Göring made his move. Himmler whispered in the ears of generals, but none had the charisma. None had the myth. The Nazi machine, so tightly wound around one man's madness, sputtered. In our world, a bomb placed behind the speaker's podium at Bürgerbrücke exploded just 13 minutes after Hitler left the building. In ours, he survived by sheer accident. But in this shadowed reflection of our past, he did not. The bomb detonated precisely as he delivered the final line of his speech. There was no screaming crowd rushing to safety, no last-minute escape, only fire and silence, and a blackened podium where a tyrant's voice once roared. News spread like ink in water, chaotic, impossible to contain. But history, like a river, finds a new course when obstructed. By December, a frail armistice was signed. Poland remained under German occupation, but a demilitarized zone was established along the Wisła. The Soviet Union, uncertain of its own place, halted its westward march. For a time, Europe exhaled, but not all evils die with a man. In the power vacuum left behind, something colder stirred, and in London, a young Winston Churchill stared at the armistice papers with haunted eyes. Across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt faced a different storm. Back in Berlin, the SS became more secretive, more organized. Under Heydrich, the Gestapo infiltrated every layer of society. And yet, without the Blitzkrieg, without the invasion of France, without the fires of Coventry and Rotterdam, the world changed. But the greatest shift, the one history books in this alternate world would someday whisper about, was the survival of the Jews of Europe. And in Tel Aviv, then just a name on a map, a different kind of future began to stir. Still, nothing in this altered path was clean. The seeds of nationalism had been planted, because when you remove the tyrant early, you don't always remove the tyranny. And in that winter of 1939, the wind was just beginning to howl. The winters that followed Hitler's death were long, grey, and eerily quiet. Germany, stripped of its theatrical dictator, became a kingdom without a crown. But power, as history teaches, does not vanish. It changes shape. In the smoky conference rooms of Berlin, behind doors lined with oaken secrets, Reinhard Heydrich crafted a new Reich, colder, more calculating, and terrifyingly efficient. No longer obsessed with grand conquests, the regime shifted inward, perfecting its control. Surveillance was no longer crude, it became art. Every whisper, every letter, every misplaced look was catalogued. Children reported on their parents. Priests vanished mid. Germany was stopped. They whispered, but for how long? Oppenheimer, unprovoked by the urgency of war, remained a physicist of thought, not of weapons. They were not raised to scream in stadiums or wave banners. They were taught silence, obedience, precision. A nation of listeners, not speakers. There was talk of European unity, treaties of commerce, student exchanges, Olympic cooperation. Germany appeared, at least to the West, as reformed, apologetic. But in Prague, the old headquarters of the SS had become something else entirely, a place without name, where ideology was rebranded, not rejected, where plans whispered by Heydrich were given to younger men with clean suits and unremarkable names. Dissent was not crushed with boots, it was erased before it formed. Libraries were rewritten, schools cleansed of memory, and in the deep archives beneath Berlin, Heydrich built something the world would not discover for decades. The foundation of continuity. The Manhattan Project was never born. The atom, untouched, slept beneath the soil. For now, Roosevelt, still president, became a prophet shouting into silence. Isolationism hardened. Congress cut military spending, and while Europe rearranged itself in gray shadows, America built highways, not battleships. A superpower unborn. Economics, diplomacy, infiltration. No swastikas, no banners, only agreements, loans, cultural outreach. German companies bought struggling French banks. German engineers helped rebuild Russian railroads. Berlin smiled, even as it extended its roots beneath every border. And in Italy, Mussolini, emboldened by Hitler's martyrdom, doubled down. There was no Berlin-Rome axis, no pax written in war blood, but ideologies still danced in unison. Files marked Subject H, not Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Hydra. It didn't matter. Different names for the same unease, that the snake's head had been severed, but his body still writhed. The world thought the Nazi fever had broken. In truth, the sickness had simply learned to hide its symptoms. In Paris, cafes reopened. The French, spared invasion, sang songs of peace, but beneath the music, the wounds of Versailles still festered. Meanwhile, in the East, Joseph Stalin watched with eyes like cold iron. The death of his would-be rival robbed him of a pretext, but also of a threat. No Barbarossa came. No panzer track scarred the Russian steppe. Instead, Stalin turned his full paranoia inward. The purges deepened. Gulags overflowed. Siberia became a graveyard of the soul. Without a German invasion to drain Soviet fear outward, the Red Terror fed on its own. But it was in the United States, where the great sleep of democracy deepened. No Pearl Harbor meant no call to arms. Still, some men saw through the fog. Alan Turing, never pressed into wartime service, continued his work in theoretical mathematics, but never decoded a single message that saved a life. And in Germany, a new generation grew under Heydrich's gaze. It was not a new war machine. It was a philosophy, a plan to ensure the Reich would not rise through fire again, but through subtlety. By 1952, the world believed the war that never was had been avoided. And all the while, in dusty corners of Britain's MI6 and America's fledgling CIA, rumors circulated. Because in this new world, this world without a world war, evil did not die. It adapted, and like all patient things, it waited for a spark. By the spring of 1961, a strange quiet had settled over Europe, not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of rooms locked from the inside. The so-called golden decades were in bloom. Skyscrapers rose, television flickered in millions of homes, and the youth danced to music imported from a free America that never went to war. But beneath the polished floor of modernity, old bones stirred. In Austria, a rising political party pushed for pragmatic cultural unification with Central Europe, and in Spain, just emerging from Franco's shadow. German consultants helped rebuild cities under plans that mirrored Berlin's 1942 reconstruction blueprint, down to the street in Berlin, now a divided city not by wall but by will. The foundation of continuity had been. Its influence reached into universities, think tanks, pharmaceutical corporations, even humanitarian foundations, not to investigate weapons or armies, but to trace ideas, curricula, cultural institutions, trade flows. The Holocaust, as we know it, had not occurred. The memory of it had never been carved into stone or bone. The Jewish people had survived, but not together. They had dispersed across continents, without the unifying trauma that forged identity. Israel was never declared. Zion was never realized. The dream, without the nightmare, remained a debate rather than a destiny. What they uncovered frightened him. A map of influence more subtle than It wasn't about conquering land. It was about owning the future. It never marched. It never shouted. It funded. It whispered. And above all, it remembered what happened in 1939. They whispered. Why did it end so suddenly? A wave of underground literature appeared in Germany, some condemning the past, some longing for it. He had become not a man, but a myth, malleable, unprovable, idealized by radicals, feared by governments, erased from public archives, but etched into collective shadow. One book, titled Der Vater, Den wir nie kannten, The Father We Never Knew, sold over 1 million copies. Its author vanished 6 months later, but in 1963, during a private tour of Europe, he requested an unscheduled visit to Berlin. What he found disturbed him. Not tanks or terror, but order, streets to clean, eyes to quiet, and a silence around the name Heydrich so complete, it made noise of its own. In Paris, student revolts questioned the very fabric of post-war peace. This world, one graffiti read, was built on an absence, and that absence has begun to rot. Reinhard Heydrich, who had died in a staged car crash in 1958, was not buried with fanfare. They're winning the peace. He told an aide in 1962, we beat their drums, but they learned to play the piano. His private writings, sealed for decades, described a network not of spies but of ideas, threading through democratic institutions like mold in the woodwork. No state funeral, no portrait in the Reichs, but those who walked his path ensured his legacy would never need a face again. In Eastern Europe, strange shifts began. Romania restructured its education system, modeled eerily on the German disciplinary philosophy. It was not conspiracy. It was choreography. Meanwhile, in London, an aging Churchill, no longer prime minister but still a looming voice, grew increasingly paranoid. Across the Atlantic, a young president named John F. Kennedy had other concerns: Vietnam, civil rights, the space race. Back home, he summoned a secret task force, and in Tel Aviv, a different silence reigned. But trauma, when delayed, returns stranger. By the end of the 1960s, a generation born after Hitler's death began asking questions their parents had carefully avoided. Elsewhere, artists and musicians began sensing something artificial in the world's harmony. Songs grew darker, films more cynical. The ghost of Hitler, paradoxically, had grown more powerful in death than he ever did in life. And all the while, the Foundation watched, patient, prepared, because they knew, if the world would not return to war, it might collapse under its own unanswered questions. And when that day came, they would be ready, not to march, but to welcome. The year was 1983. 44 years had passed since Hitler's body had been burned beyond recognition in the ruins of Bucha. 44 years since a war had been halted before it truly began. And yet, something in the world felt ... off. Not broken, just misaligned. They stood before a mural. Modern, abstract, geometric. One asked the guide, who did we fight in the war? It never needed armies when it had curriculums. It didn't burn books. It rewrote them. It didn't silence dissent. It replaced it with disinterest. And perhaps its cruelest trick of all, it gave the people comfort. The guide hesitated, then smiled thinly. There was no war. The papers detailed something called Project Margaret, Project Dawn. Its goal, the re-education of post-war Europe through narrative manipulation, economic dependency, and slow cultural fusion. The absence of trauma had not spared the nation. It had left it hollow. A people unused to sacrifice grew restless, angry without knowing why. We return what was erased. We are the continuity. Within hours, stock markets in Frankfurt, Brussels, and Milan experienced coordinated anomalies. Electric grids failed in Budapest. A professor of sociology in Warsaw committed suicide, leaving behind only a note. History is returning. They had built monuments to a victory they never earned. And now, the ghosts of battles unfought haunted their sons. Only peace, and the cost of preserving it. Libraries flooded in perfect, precise patterns, always after midnight. The world called it coincidence. A lie, not of malice, but of design. We were allowed to live so they could show us something worse. A world where forgetting wins. As if history had skipped a beat, and the music never quite found rhythm again. In that year, a group of German schoolchildren visited a museum in Dresden. For you see, in this world without World War II, there were no clear villains, no liberation of camps, no Nuremberg trials, no black and white reels of horror played before teary-eyed crowds. Evil remained theoretical, a concept studied, not confronted, and where horror is never named, it is never truly defeated. It only needs time. The foundation of continuity had succeeded, not in conquest, but in erosion. It wore down truth with quiet repetition. But a copy of the files appeared 6 months later in an anonymous package sent to a university professor in Copenhagen. That professor vanished for what is more seductive than a world without open war? What deeper dream than the illusion of peace? But the dream was cracking. In 1985, a low-level archivist in Vienna, name redacted from all known records, discovered a trove of sealed documents buried beneath the Ministry of Culture. He fled the country within days. No one heard from him again. In America, a country untested by global war, the cracks were psychological. Suicide rates climbed. Conspiracy movements bloomed. And then came the signal. On January 12, 1989, across dozens of shortwave channels, a message was broadcast in a voice that sounded eerily synthesized. We remember what was not. Then came the disappearances, not of politicians, but of thinkers, historians, architects, archivists, anyone who could stitch the past back together. Files disappeared. Film reels melted in vaults, but some knew better. One of them, an old Jewish man named Abram Tessulman, a violin maker in Krakow, wrote a final letter to his granddaughter before vanishing. We did not die. And perhaps that is the cruelest future of all. Not one of bombs or gas chambers or marching boots, but one where tyranny does not need violence. Time to wait. Time to soften memory. Time to convince a generation that nothing ever happened. Because when you erase the fire, you do not save the forest. You leave it dry and quiet and ready for the next spark.